Hello, and thanks for joining us on today's webinar about raising iGen. I'm Chad Ragsdale, and I'm the Academic Dean here at Ozark Christian College. And our hope is that these webinars and the next level videos are a way for us to continue with our mission to equip men and women to be kingdom workers, to be involved in Christian service. And before we get going, I just want to say a few things here at the outset. If you're signed up for this webinar, you're going to receive a link within the next 24 hours for an on-demand copy of today's webinar for you to review or to look at. I know there's a lot of people that have signed up for the webinar but aren't able to join us live, so that link will be coming out sometime the next day. During the webinar, you are free, obviously, to ask questions. There's a Q&A panel. They're available to you. I'll try to get to any questions that are asked throughout the course of the webinar. And then thirdly, if you've been blessed by Ozark Christian College or by these resources, please consider a financial partnership with our college. You can do that simply by going to occ.edu/donate. So yeah, the topic for this webinar today is about iGen, raising iGen, ministering to iGen, reaching out to iGen. And obviously, here at Ozark, we're very invested in this topic. I'm very invested in this topic, as now we are teaching a new generation of students that is, in some respects, very different than generations that have gone before them. And so we want to be more effective at that. We want to be empowering these students and training these students to effectively go out into the world, to involve themselves in ministry and Christian service. And so we have to know kind of what are the trends, what is this generation really all about, what are their assumptions, what are the things that they're struggling with, you know, how have things changed for this recent generation? So here at Ozark, we're obviously very invested in that. I know that many of you watching this webinar are very invested in that as well. And just on a personal level, I have two iGen children myself. I have two kids right now in junior high, and they are growing up in a culture and in an environment that is very different than certainly the culture and environment that I grew up in, and very different than the culture and environment that existed even 5-10 years ago. And so just as a dad, I'm really interested in studying this generation so that I can know my kids better, and so that I can know, hopefully, how to be a better parent to them and lead them in the way of the Lord in during times that are very changing, during times that are very challenging as well. And so I'm going to show you some various things during the next hour or so. The first thing that I want to do, though, is I'm a professor, so one of the things I like to do is share resources. So a couple books that I just really strongly recommend on kind of understanding the trends and understanding where our culture is at, especially where this generation is at. A couple of books that I strongly recommend. First of all, a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. It's by two individuals, Greg Lukianoff and John Haidt. John Haidt in particular is an author that I've been following for a while. He's a professor at NYU in psychology, just a great cultural observer on just different trends that have been happening, especially on college campuses across the country. This is a fantastic book, especially if you are in any way ministering to high school or college students. Very good book to have, as is this one. Jean Twenge, I think that's how she pronounces her name, professor at San Diego State University. She wrote a book called iGen. She is, I don't know if she coined the term iGen, but she's certainly one who has popularized it. And if you're a parent, or especially if you're a youth minister, I can't emphasize enough how important this book is. If you want to know the mindset that your students have now compared to previous generations of students, this book is just so helpful and so insightful. A couple other books. Sometimes this generation is called Gen Z. I don't really like that title for this generation for a variety of different reasons. I think it actually doesn't say nearly enough about this generation. It seems kind of lazy, frankly. But sometimes it is called Gen Z. There's this book by James Emery White that he wrote on Gen Z, which is pretty helpful, especially from a Christian perspective. And then also the Barna Group has done a lot of research more recently on Generation Z. Again, that's what they call it. And there's a resource that they have available. You can buy it on Amazon with some of the study that they've done. So I would recommend those resources to you and I'm going to be commenting on some of these resources as we move forward. In Twinge's book, these are some dominant trends that she identifies in iGen, and these are actually the different chapters of the book. Just based on her analysis and based on the study that she's done, here's the conclusions that she's coming up with about this generation. First of all, they're in no hurry. The extension of childhood into adolescence. Students are growing up slower. I know that sounds counterintuitive because we think they're being exposed to so many different things, so many adult things at a very young age. We think that they're growing up faster, but that's actually not the case. What they've found is the average college freshman today entering college at the age of 18 has a mindset that's more equivalent to a 15-year-old, 10, 15 years ago. And so students, generally speaking, are growing up slower. Adolescence is being extended into young adulthood. And so they're really in no hurry to cross those kind of transition or threshold moments that we typically associate with coming into adulthood. They don't remember life without the web. That's why she calls it iGen, and that's why I like the title iGen. She dates this generation as starting in 1995 and going till about 2010. And the reason that she chose 1995 is because 1995 is when Windows 95 came out. And Windows 95 was an operating system that made the internet ubiquitous. It made the internet widely accessible by millions of people for the first time. We're getting online with Windows 95. And so students that were born in 1995, they literally do not have any living memory of life before the internet. And I think it's impossible to overstate just how significant that is. The internet fundamentally changed what it means for us to be human. In the same way that motorized transportation changed what it means to be human. The Gutenberg press changed the experience of being human. And so that transition from an analog world to a digital world has changed us and changed our experiences in so many important ways. And this generation is growing up in a time where that's their only experience. They are digital natives. I was born in 1977. I can actually remember a time pre-internet. I can remember certainly a time pre-smartphone, pre-social media. I went through my formative years, my adolescent years, largely without the internet, without social media, without cell phones. My formative identity shaping years were pre-digital in that way. iGen is going through their formative years online. They're going through their formative years with smartphones, with Facebook. Their identity shaping years are being spent online, and that is changing them in significant ways that we need to pay attention to. It's changing them for the good to a certain degree, but it's also really changing them for the bad in ways that we need to wake up to. In-person no more, the decline of in-person social interaction. We'll talk about that a little bit. Insecure, the sharp rise in mental health issues among this generation. The decline of religion. Twinge says in her book that this is shaping up to be the least religious generation in history. They are simply not involving themselves in religion even in a comparative way to millennials, and millennials themselves weren't even very religious. Insulated but not intrinsic, the interest in safety and decline in civic involvement. They live very insulated lives. They're not typically involved in traditional institutions like the church, but other traditional institutions that previous generations would have involved themselves with. Income insecurity, new attitudes towards work. In some respects, better attitudes towards work. Being kind of going through the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, has given this generation a work ethic and an attitude towards work that's different than millennials. Kind of the stereotype picture of millennials is one of entitlement, showing up to work and expecting to be promoted within the next, weeks or months. That's not really typical of iGen though. iGen, they're coming to work with the assumption that work is not going to be stable in the same way that it was stable for my parents, certainly not in the same way it was stable for my grandparents. When you could graduate from high school, get a job and work in the same job for 50 years, iGen knows that's not going to be their reality. That's not going to be their experience. So iGen typically, they're much more willing to simply get a job, to simply do what needs to be done to get a paycheck, little bit stronger work ethic in that way, but also not a lot of loyalty towards work or investment in a particular vocation or career, because they know that it's likely to change over time and several times throughout their life. Indefinite, new attitude towards sex, relationships, and children. In other words, what Twinge says is they have less sex, they have less relationships, especially married relationships, and they have less children than previous generations. Inclusive, acceptance, equality, free speech debates, very inclusive generation. That's part of the byproduct of growing up online in an environment where you are, even if you're living in central Kansas, you're exposed to a very small world with a lot of diversity, a lot of diverse perspectives and opinions and lifestyles. And so this generation tends to be much more inclusive in those respects, but also independent, lastly. Less partisan in their politics. One of the surprising things about the 2016 election was that 40% of the iGen eligible voters, 40% voted for Donald Trump. That's not what they were anticipating. They were anticipating trends that were similar to millennials. Millennials, as a general rule, vote much more left of center. They certainly are less inclined to vote for someone like Donald Trump, but iGen, 40% of them voted for Donald Trump. Of those iGen eligible voters that were more liberal in their politics, what they found was 80% of those voters voted for Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primaries. So you've got iGen voting for both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And it's a kind of a head scratcher how that could be the case, because those candidates seem to be very different in a lot of different ways. But the one thing that they have in common is that they're anti-establishment. They're independent. They are they're not from the old boys network, and that tends to be that tends to strike a chord with this generation, which is much more individualistic in their politics. They have less loyalty to established party systems, Republican, Democrat, whatever. They're much more inclined to go outside of those institutions and express a vote that reflects their individualism. So that's just in Twinge's book. That's some of the big ideas that she brings out. Now I want to get into some of the details here, some of the specifics on this generation, some trends that we can see happening. 12th graders in 2015 are going out less often than 8th graders did as recently as 2009. So iGen is much less interactive and social than previous generations. And, the reason for that, I think, is somewhat obvious. The reason is they're interacting through their phones. They're interacting through social media. They're interacting online. Instead of physically being with each other and going out, they're tending to stay inside, isolated by themselves, and just interacting through their devices, interacting through technology. The number of sexually active ninth graders has been cut in half since the 1990s. This generation tends to have less sex than previous generations. Nearly 40% of iGen high school seniors in 2016 had never tried alcohol at all. And the number of eighth graders who have tried alcohol has been cut nearly in half since the 1990s. iGen teens also fight less with their parents. 66% had regular fights in 2005. The number had dropped to 56% in 2015. Now, what do these numbers tell us? In some respects, these numbers are great, right? It's great for kids not to fight with their parents. It's great for high school students not to drink alcohol, get drunk. It's great for ninth graders not to be sexually active. These numbers are great. But the reason why these numbers are declining isn't because there's some sort of revival in morality. There's not been some sort of revival in traditional morality. The reason why these numbers are doing what they're doing is because iGen is living a more isolated existence. They're less inclined to have those deep, abiding relationships. They're less inclined to go out on the weekends. They're less inclined to rebel against their parents because they're just sort of going with the flow. Now, the byproduct or the negative implication, though, is that when a lot of iGen students get to college, they kind of go crazy, whether it's with alcohol or with sexual relationships or whatever, and that they lack the maturity to handle those things well. Oftentimes they lack the moral foundation to handle those things well. And so when the restraints are taken off, they tend to overindulge in these things to a destructive level. iGen is less likely to drive and have a job than previous generations as well. iGen, they're not as interested in getting their license as millennials or certainly Gen X. A car to iGen doesn't symbolize the same thing that it symbolized to their parents. To me, a car and driver's license symbolize freedom. I get to have some level of freedom to go where I want, when I want. iGen has less desire to do that. Next point. A stunning 31% more 8th and 10th graders felt lonely in 2015 than in 2011, along with 22% more 12th graders. Every indicator of mental health issues on the survey reached all-time highs in 2016, rating emotional health below average, feeling overwhelmed, expecting to seek counseling, and feeling depressed. Major changes began to happen in 2012. Now, 2012 was around the first graduating class of iGen. It's when iGen went to college in 2012. And what they found in study after study is in 2011 and 2012, there was a spike in all of these indicators related to loneliness, mental health, suicidal tendencies. There was just this spike across the board in so many of these different questions, which there's a lot of different explanations as to why that might be the case. But I think one good explanation for that is that these are students that grew up on social media. They grew up with smartphones. And in ways that we're not always aware of, that is negatively affecting their mental health in some pretty dramatic ways. I'll return back to that here in a second. Between 2009 and 2015, the number of high school girls who seriously considered suicide in the past year increased 34%, and the number who attempted suicide increased 43%. These are numbers that we've got to pay attention to. And not enough people are asking the question, why are we seeing these spikes? And I'll just tell you, at Ozark Christian College, we're seeing some of these same spikes in students coming to the school, struggling with depression, struggling with anxiety, struggling with all sorts of mental health issues. And what we're seeing in our students is somewhat typical across the board with all college students. They're struggling in ways that culture isn't necessarily aware of, or at least they're struggling for reasons that culture isn't always aware of. So some other things on this, I think I might have skipped oh yeah, I did skip a slide, sorry. 12th graders in 2015 spent twice as much time online as 12th graders in 2006. That shouldn't necessarily surprise us. It's also tricky nowadays to define what exactly do we mean by online. It's becoming less and less the case of just sitting behind a computer and physically going online. We're just kind of always online now. In 2015, 9% of teens played video games more than 40 hours a week. That's stunning to me. The number of teens who get together with their friends every day has been cut in half in just 15 years. Teens who spend more time on screen activities, this is a quote from Twenge in her book, teens who spend more time on screen activities are more likely to be unhappy. Those who spend more time on non-screen activities are more likely to be happy. And I like that quote because of how simplistic it sounds. And it really is simple. The more screen time you spend, the less happy you'll be. The less screen time you have, the happier you'll be. 8th graders who are heavy users of social media, and heavy users she defines as anything more than 2 hours a day. 8th graders who are heavy users of social media increase their risk of depression by 27%, while those who play sports, go to religious services, or even do homework cut their risks significantly. Parents got to hear this. It's just the facts of the data. It's where the data is pointing us that if you want to increase the likelihood of your child, especially your daughter, having mental health issues, then by all means, get her on social media in junior high. If you want her to have increased risk for depression, for suicide rates, if you want her to feel lonely, to have a chronic fear of missing out, then just get her on social media as early as possible. The data just doesn't lie. The data supports this idea that if you want your teenager to be happier, you will put off social media as long as possible, and you'll put off smartphones and you'll limit screen time as much as possible because it's having a devastating effect on their mental health. So some other things as far as trends, just big trends, big ideas. I see a question here. I'm going to get to this question here in a little bit, but what value do you see then in healthy small groups in the lives of iGen students? I'm going to talk about that, I think, towards the end of my time here. But some other trends that you see, they're connected and lonely. You see on the chart there, the year 2007 is when the iPhone is released, and look how that chart just spikes after 2007. The percentage of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders who agree or mostly agree with the statement, I feel left out of things, or a lot of times I feel lonely. The introduction of this new technology caused a spike in the feeling of loneliness, which only makes sense, right? So all of a sudden you have this device in your pocket that tells you everything that your friends are doing without you. And it shows you exactly, it paints their experiences in the best light possible. And here I am just sitting at home by myself. And all of a sudden now I'm feeling depressed. Now all of a sudden I'm feeling lonely. And so social media has connected these students to each other. But in that connection with each other, it's actually isolated them even more. It's made them feel even more lonely than they were before. This is also a quote from Twenge's book. She said, in just the 18 years between 1990 and 2008, the use of the phrase "make yourself happy" more than tripled in American books in the Google book database. The phrase "don't need anyone" barely existed in American books before the 1970s and then quadrupled between 1970 and 2008. The relationship unfriendly phrase "never compromise" doubled between 1990 and 2008. And what other phrases increased? "I love me." And that leads me to my next slide. Not only are they connected and lonely, they're also individualistic and uninstituted, which I'm not really sure is a word, but I created it because I think it fits. This is according to Barna, the percentage of each generation identifying as atheists. You can see that with iGen, it's 13%, compared to Generation X, which is my generation, at only 6%. So they are, by uninstituted, what I'm really getting at there is that this generation, they're hyper-individualistic to the extent that they don't involve themselves, or they have a tendency not to involve themselves with traditional institutions. And certainly the church would fit the category of a traditional institution. They are unchurched. They are more free and open about calling themselves or labeling themselves not just unchurched, but even atheists, because they are not connected to these traditional institutions. When the boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials were in college, students rated raising a family either highest or second highest. During the millennial years, 2002 to 2007, raising a family was rated highest each year. By 2008, being very well off financially had muscled its way to first place. By 2015, raising a family had slipped to third on the priority list behind being very well off financially and helping others in difficulty. So the first time that had occurred since it was included on the list of life goals since 1969. And so basically what this data is showing us is that this generation, iGen, is less interested, not just in the institution of the church and religion, they're also interested less in the institution even of the family and of getting married. You see now that half of US adults are married today, down from 72% in 1960. In 2016, it's now 50% of adults 18 or older who are married. And so this generation is amplifying their loneliness by choosing to disassociate themselves from any traditional institutions in society where they can experience real life-on-life relationships. And that's, like I said, only increasing their sense of loneliness. So one of the questions that I have in front of me here from JD Miller is, what value do you see then in healthy small groups in the lives of iGen students? I can't emphasize enough how important and valuable that is. I had a conversation with our youth minister at our church several months ago as I was reading Twinge's book. And I told him, I'm like, you know what? Honestly, never apologize to anyone for having an activity at the church that is quote unquote unspiritual, like a fifth quarter or something like that, or just a hangout. Because honestly, these students need that. These students need to have those opportunities, those excuses, just to physically be together, to physically hang out together. And I would just encourage you, if you're a youth minister out there, give students the opportunity to take a break from their devices. Don't allow them in a small group setting to continue to be on their devices, building a wall between themselves and other people. One of the things that we've got to train these students in, something that certainly a lot of us older people just take for granted, is just the importance of social interaction, of face-to-face interaction in the same physical space, giving each other the attention that we need, the attention that we deserve. Some of those skills are underdeveloped in younger students because of the amount of time that they've spent interacting behind a screen or just sending a text message instead of actually calling someone. So I think small groups in a ministry, incredibly important to train these students to, I guess, to interact in a more human way. I have another question here. What do we mean by delaying adulthood? I hear this often, but what are the metrics used? How do we differentiate between the delaying of adulthood and a shift in the definition of adulthood? And some of it is a shift in definition, I suppose. The Twinge's argument in her book is that there are certain thresholds of adulthood that this generation is crossing later. So certain thresholds of adulthood would be getting your driver's license, getting your first even part-time job, having sex, getting married, all these sorts of things that have been traditional thresholds of adulthood. And this generation is putting off those mile markers until about 3 years later than previous generations. They're getting their driver's license later. They're getting their first part-time job later. They're having sex later. They're certainly getting married later. They're delaying everything. So that what that means is, and they're also delayed in terms of growing in certain normal social interactions too, because they spent so much of their life online. And so by the time they become freshmen in college, the mindset, Twinge is arguing, the mindset of an 18-year-old is more typical of a 15-year-old just 10 years ago. And so they're delayed by at least 3 years. Another question here is, are the marriage statistics impacted at all by divorce rates? Just wondering if marriage doesn't look as appealing to them. I don't know that that's the case because, divorce rates have been pretty steady, actually, for over 30 years. Divorce rates haven't really moved much up or down. So iGen is certainly not the first generation that has dealt with the reality of divorce. I think that the main reason why marriage is unattractive to them is because, frankly, they've grown up in in a very individualistic sort of culture where marriage has just simply not been promoted as being as important as their own personal development, getting an education, getting a career, making enough money. Marriage simply has become less important in their eyes than other goals that they might have. Previous generations, they would have said, one of the critical ways that I discover who I am is by getting married. That's not what this generation is saying. This generation is saying, I need to discover who I am, and then maybe at a point in the future, I'll invite another person into my life. It's just a very different mindset about marriage. Another question here, how does the increase of screen time among iGen mirror the increase of screen time in their adult parents? And does loneliness in their adult counterparts increase iGen's loneliness? And I think it does. I think, iGen, they're digital natives. And so they, I know that even with my own kids, my own kids will lecture me about the amount of time that I spend looking at a screen. A lot of kids have expressed concern about their parents choosing to interact more with a screen than to interact with them. I actually read an article on this just really recently about teenagers rebelling against their parents' screen time. And so I think in some respects, we are providing some sort of a model for our kids that they're looking at and that they're learning from. I think the difference, though, is this. Like I said, I didn't grow up on screen time. So screen time doesn't really have the same type of effect on me than it does on my kids who are growing up with screen time in their formative years. It's because they're going through it in their formative years, it affects them in a different way than it affects me. And so it's something that I've got to be aware of. I'm going to go back and hit some of these other questions here in a moment, but I'm going to move forward here. Another thing that's typical about iGen is that they're informed but also overwhelmed. From the beginning of time until 2003, we generated 5 exabytes of data. That's a lot of data. That's all the books and news and movies and information and history. Now we generate 5 exabytes of data every 10 minutes. Which is crazy. Our kids have more information available to them than any generation throughout all of human history. And you can make the argument that it's too much. It's overwhelming them, having all this information available. You look at this, this chart on the side, what percent with at least one suicide risk factor. And that's tracked by, or that's compared to the hours a day that a student is on their electronic device. And you can see at 5+ hours, the risk of a suicide or a suicide risk factor just spikes. So the more time you spend on a screen, the more risk factors you have. Another statistic here, this is the 8th, 10th, and 12th graders with a score of 3 out of 5 or higher on depressive symptoms. This is between 1991 and 2015. And you see there around 2012, you see this spike, especially among females, on depressive symptoms. And what Twenge argues in her book, and she makes a really good case, is that the amount of information that these students are now exposed to is actually overwhelming them to such an extent that it's giving them mental health problems. It's making them more prone to things like depression, suicidal tendencies, etc. So they're informed, but they're also very overwhelmed by the amount of information that's available. I mean, think about it this way. A student could get, or not just a student, any of us, we could get on Twitter. And in a moment, we can see things happening around the world, things that have no direct relevance to our lives. Like, it's literally not going to change our lives in one way or another. But all of a sudden now I'm exposed to the joys, but also the pain and the heartbreak and the anger, oftentimes, of people living all around the world. It's like I'm constantly subjecting myself to that fire hose of information. And that can't help but overwhelm me, just constantly being exposed to that information overload is going to affect my mental health. And we're seeing, especially with young women, we're seeing that that is the case. Now, in the other book that I mentioned, the Coddling of the American Mind book, again, wonderful book, outstanding points. But as a college administrator, as a college professor, I'm really interested in what they have to say in this book, because the principal argument that's made in this book is that our young people, from about the time they enter into junior high or maybe even younger, they're actually being told 3 great untruths that are crippling them as adults. That they're not setting themselves up for success as adults because they're being told these 3 untruths by their parents, by their teachers, by administrators at their colleges. And so the 3 untruths that they mention in the book are these 3 here. I'm going to break down each one in a little bit more detail. But again, and this isn't really a Christian book. Matter of fact, Jonathan Haidt, I believe, is an atheist. So this isn't necessarily a Christian observation. It's just a cultural observation as a whole. These are untruths that are hindering our young people. So the first untruth is this: the untruth of fragility. That whatever doesn't kill you makes you weaker, which kind of runs counter to the old wisdom that whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. This generation has grown up with safetyism, is the term that they use in the book, where these children have been told their entire lives that the world is a very dangerous place. It's a dangerous place physically. It's a dangerous place emotionally. And so we have to protect you. As a parent, it's my job to protect you from anything that might make you unsafe. And so this is the generation of safetyism. And what's happened, especially among college students, is that physical safety has actually been replaced by also emotional and intellectual safety. So not only do I not want to be put in physical environments where I'm unsafe, I also don't want to be exposed to ideas and thoughts and philosophies that challenge me or make me feel uncomfortable, because that's making me unsafe as well. So it's not just about physical safety, it's also about emotional and intellectual safety on college campuses. And they spend a lot of time talking about this in the book. The contrary wisdom that they recommend in the book is seek out challenges rather than eliminate or avoid everything that feels unsafe. The illustration that they use is, if you imagine like a china cup, it's a very fragile thing. If you drop it on the floor, it's going to shatter in a million pieces. It's a very fragile thing. On the other hand, you have like one of these kids' sippy cups, okay, made out of plastic. You drop that on the floor, it's resilient. It's not going to shatter in a million pieces. It's resilient. But dropping it on the floor, it doesn't really make that cup better. It's just a resilient cup. So you have a china cup and you have a children's sippy cup. And he says neither one of those illustrations works for children. Children are not fragile like a china cup, okay? But they're also not resilient like that kid's sippy cup. The word that they actually use is anti-fragile. That there are some things that actually, if you think about our muscles, your muscles only get stronger if you work them out, if you exercise. You've got to break down your muscles to an appropriate degree so that they can be built up. And if you don't do this, if you don't work out your muscles, then they will atrophy and eventually die. And he says children are anti-fragile in the same way. If you spend your entire life protecting them so that they never encounter anything that might put them at risk, they never encounter any ideas that might challenge them, they're constantly and almost neurotically concerned about their safety, then what you're doing is you're actually hampering their emotional and personal development. You're inhibiting their growth into adulthood by treating them with that level of fragility. The virtue that I've attached to this is instead of living with the untruth of fragility, we should instead instill in our children a life of hope. That we actually, and this is a biblical principle, it's a biblical idea, that those things that happen to us will be and can be worked for the good of those who love Jesus Christ, that God will work those things in our lives for good. This is a biblical principle. God uses hardship as discipline. But what enables us to endure that hardship is living a life of hope, knowing that there is a God who loves us, there is a God who cares for us, there is a God who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and I can live my life in hope in the midst of challenges, in the midst of difficulties. I can live my life in hope, knowing that God is a keeper of promises. And so instead of giving into fragility, I can instead choose to live a life of hope. I see some other questions coming up here. I'm going to get to those here in just a moment as we get towards the end of this presentation. So hold on to those questions. The second untruth is the untruth of emotional reasoning. Always trust your feelings. Always trust your heart. Wherever your heart leads you, that's where you need to go. Your feelings, your opinions can never be wrong. That's what this generation is being told. Always trust your feelings. Always follow your heart. And I'm not going to go into this in much detail, just because I don't really have the time right now. But the vocabulary that they attach to this is the vocabulary of microaggressions. Some of you may have heard that term. The triumph of impact over intent. So it doesn't really matter what your intent was when you said something to me. All that matters is the emotional impact that you have on me, because my emotions are always right. My emotions are more important than your intent. And we're training our children to trust their emotions instead of questioning their emotions, questioning their feelings. And the wisdom that they talk about in the book is free yourself from cognitive distortions rather than always trusting your initial feelings. Subject your emotions to criticism, to questions. Interrogate your feelings instead of simply trusting that your feelings are always accurate to reality. The virtue I associate with this is to live a life of faith. To live a life of faith. Instead of always trusting our feelings, live lives of resolute and unbending faith instead. The third untruth is the untruth of us versus them, that life is a battle between good people and evil people. The vocabulary here, again, I'm not going to break this down in much detail, but the vocabulary that they use here is the vocabulary of intersectionality, which is basically, just to put it very, very simply, it's a sociological philosophy that is it's based on identity politics, and it sees oppression being tied to the particular groups that you inhabit or the particular groups that other people inhabit. It basically is a way of subdividing people into different tribes, different tribal identities that basically do war with each other. And a whole generation of young people is being trained basically in tribal warfare. Instead of seeing the good in each other, instead of allowing for some grace and some compassion and some mutual understanding, instead they're being trained to see all of life as this battle. There's good people over here, there's bad people over here. I'm a good person, that's a bad person. I don't need to get to know them, I don't need to find out their story. I just know that they're in a different tribe than I am, and so we're going to fight it out. The wisdom that they offer instead is, take a generous view of other people. This sounds like common sense, but unfortunately it's not nearly as common as it should be. Take a generous view of other people and look for nuance rather than assuming the worst about people. The virtue, of course, is to live a life of love. Instead of seeing the worst in other people who might disagree with you politically or who might be from a different tribe than you sociologically, instead of choosing to see the worst in them, choose to live a life of charity, to choose to live a life of love and understanding, instead of just seeing life as this battle between us and them. And so Lukianoff and Haidt in their book say this generation, iGen, they're growing up with these three untruths, and it is squelching their ability to grow and to mature. And so as parents and as youth workers, we've got to take some steps to counteract these three untruths in their lives. Just one more thing on this us versus them mentality. There was actually a study done on Twitter, and the animosity and the fighting that often takes place on Twitter. And they mapped out political conversation on Twitter, right-leaning conservative conversation versus left-leaning conversation. And they were able to map it out. And what they found is on Twitter, these two worlds don't really interact or intersect hardly at all. The moral and emotional language on Twitter is what they call a bifurcated concentration. There's really very little in the middle, and instead we're being taken to the extremes. And that's the environment that our kids are growing up in. Our kids are growing up in an extremist environment of us versus them, and there's very little room for nuance in between. And social media has just allowed this to happen even more so. All right, the last slide I want to say here, and then I'm going to get into some of these questions. This is something that I put together. I'm not going to go through this in much detail. I want to make this very basic point. Our world, our culture has changed dramatically. I think that's safe to say. It's changed dramatically, especially over the last 10, 15 years. I'm not so convinced that we're always aware of the different ways that it's changed. And by we, I'm speaking mostly as a parent here. I'm speaking as a youth worker. I'm speaking as a teacher. I'm not always aware of how my kids, and increasingly my college students, how they're growing up in literally in a different world than the world that I grew up in. And I've started to call this, and I borrowed this from David Kinnaman at Barna Research. I've come to call this the Jerusalem mindset versus the Babylonian mindset. And of course, this goes back to Old Testament imagery. You know, when Israel got sent into exile, there was, of course, a generation that had grown up in Jerusalem and now suddenly found themselves in another land, a foreign land, different language, different culture, different religion. But they still had a memory of what Jerusalem was like. But there was also a generation, though, that grew up in Babylon. They didn't have any living memory of Jerusalem. They only knew about Jerusalem from what their grandparents and their parents told them about it. Instead, their only experience was with Babylon. So Jerusalem to them was what we might call a mediated experience. It wasn't a direct experience. And a lot of immigrant families talk about this same type of experience when a family immigrates from one country to another. That first generation, the grandparents' generation, you know, they still have a living memory of what life and culture was like in the old country, what values they had, what traditions they had, and they were meaningful, they were important. The language is important, the food is important, the way that we interact socially, it's all important. But with their kids, and especially with their grandkids, they may have a connection back to that old culture, but it's only a mediated connection. It's not a direct connection. Instead, their kids and their grandkids, they're growing up in an American culture with different language, different food, different social interactions, just different culture in general. And so they don't have the living memory that their grandparents do of the old country. So they're much less tied to it. And so for those of us, like if you're a boomer watching this, or if you're a Gen Xer watching this, you kind of grew up in Jerusalem. You grew up in a culture that really doesn't exist anymore. And your children are growing up in a world, they're growing up in a post-Christian environment that is very different than the environment that you grew up in. You grew up with a Jerusalem mindset, many of you, whereas your kids and certainly your grandkids, they're growing up with a Babylon mindset. And you can see on this chart, and you can look at, I'm going to put this on my blog later so you can see this in more detail. But you could see how these two different mindsets compare to each other. And you could see maybe why there's a generational communication breakdown between those who are older and who are living with a much different mindset than those who are younger. Now, the last slide I want to show is really kind of a practical slide, we've spent some time talking about some trends and some tendencies in this generation. But that leads naturally to the question, well, what do we do about it? Is there anything that we can do about it? How do we effectively minister to and raise this new generation? I have just a handful of ideas, and so I'll go through them pretty quickly. But the first idea is this: in regards to faith and practice, we've got to stop assuming anything. Now, this is going to reveal my bias because I'm an apologetics professor too. But we cannot assume, even with the kids growing up in our churches, we cannot assume anything when it comes to faith. We can't assume that they know much of anything about the practices that we do or the traditions that we have. Because remember, they're growing up in Babylon. They're not growing up in Jerusalem. And so it's on us to always give the why, to always give the explanation, to make sure that we're teaching the basics, answering their questions, trying to help them navigate this difficult tension that they have between living their lives at school in a generation, in a culture that is sometimes very antagonistic towards Christian ideas and Christian beliefs. How do I navigate that? How do I live sort of an integrated identity between church and home and school? Because what often takes place is that instead of an integrated identity, we have sort of this fragmented identity. So I'll choose to operate one way at school. I'll operate one way at home. I'll operate maybe a different way at church. And so we're kind of raising these students that have kind of schizophrenic tendencies in their identity. They don't really know what's real or who they really are. Who am I on Facebook versus who am I when I'm not on Facebook? Who am I at church versus who am I when I go to school? So as youth workers, as parents, we've got to do the hard work of helping students have an integrated identity, teaching them, showing them, probably more effectively, showing them what an identity in Christ really means and what it looks like. Don't assume anything. Another idea, this is a prayer I pray every day, frankly. It's an Ephesians 1:17 prayer. In Ephesians 1:17, Paul is praying for the Ephesians. Ephesus, difficult place to be a Christian, difficult place to be a disciple. And so Paul prays for the Ephesian Christians. He says, I pray that you would be full of a spirit of wisdom and discernment so that you would know Christ better. And I pray that for my kids every day. I pray, God, give them wisdom. God, help them to be discerning. Help them not to just go with the flow, but actually look beneath the surface of things and be discerning about what's really going on, what's really happening, what truth really looks like. Because there's one thing that your phone will never give you. Your iPhone will never give you wisdom. It'll give you information. It won't give you wisdom. And so I want to pray for wisdom and for discernment in my kids, because I believe that is what is going to keep them anchored and tethered to Christ in a really confusing time to be growing up. Watch out for cyber wolves. I think that this goes without saying, but I need to say it anyway. You own all the technology in your house. If you're a parent watching this right now, you own all the technology in your house. That means that the devices that your kids have, they belong to you. And you have to be the adult and instill good habits in your kids. And you have to also model that good habits to your kids, or those good habits to your kids. One really simple thing is, never allow your kids, especially your teenage kids, to have unrestricted access to the internet, whether it's on their phones or on tablets or on computers or whatever, and never allow them to sleep with their devices. That I can't emphasize that enough. It's just a really bad idea to allow children to have devices in their rooms with them when they're supposed to be sleeping. Causes all sorts of trouble. So be very careful about cyber wolves. Have hard conversations about when is it appropriate, if at all, for my kids to be on social media. We've tried to be consistent with our kids. We've told them there won't be any social media in our house until at least high school, and maybe even beyond that. And they just know that with dad, that's a non-starter. You're not going to get on Instagram. You're not going to have Facebook. I don't care if your other friends have it. I know too much to let you have social media. It's not going to be good for your mental health. It's not going to be good for your discipleship. Make intentional decisions about technology in your house, and also explain those decisions to your students. Explain to them why we're choosing to live our lives a little bit differently than other people live their lives. Do hard things and do normal things. I especially with my 14-year-old son, we have a lot of conversations about grit and about how important it is to do hard things, because it's really easy to take the easy way out. It's really easy not to do anything and just to not do hard things. And so we want to be people of grit, people who do hard things, and also people who do normal things. Listen, these students, they're growing up in very extreme times. Everything's extreme. Everything's polarized. And so train your kids to do normal things. Here's how you have a normal social interaction. Here's the proper and polite way to talk to an adult. Here's some things that you need to know as you're getting ready to go to work. Just some things that we might normally take for granted. Here's how you say thank you in the proper way. Some things that we might take for granted, we can't take those things for granted when they're growing up on technology and they're not learning all those normal social cues. Now, I want to answer some of these questions here. One question is, what's an appropriate balance of shutting out technology to encourage real face-to-face relationship and embracing iGen's technology leaning for the sake of engagement? How do we make a friend out of such a mental and emotional health enemy? Gosh, that's a great question. And honestly, I'm trying to figure that out. I'll just be completely honest with you. I'm not sure that I can give you a magic formula for that. I've become more and more convinced that there is something necessary about real person-to-person interaction, just talking in a real way with real people. And so the way that I see technology is that it should be a launching point, but it's not, maybe I could put it this way. Technology is a porch, but it's not the house. It's not the living room. So you don't want to live in technology. You can maybe use technology as a launching point for those social interactions and relationships. But I always want to be moving things, if I can, be moving things to those real world interactions. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is how texting has changed our social interactions with each other, and how we're so much more inclined to just text now instead of actually interacting with people in a real way. And so what if we took one day where every time we had an impulse to text, instead of texting, we picked up the phone, we actually called someone that we wanted to text? How would that change the way that we have a relationship with that person? Or what about this? What if instead of sending an email or sending a text, what if we actually sat down and hand wrote a letter one day? And what would be the consequence of that? How would that change the way that we interact with each other when we actually take the time to physically write a letter? These are just some of the things that I'm thinking about, but what I do know is that technology can't be where we live. Technology might introduce that interaction, but we can't stay there. It's a great question, though. I hope to figure it out more someday. Another question I have here is, are kids not having sex, or is the way they're having sex changing? Is it becoming less relational by shifting porn and sexting? And what do those stats look like? I have another question here about pornography. What research have you found about pornography usage in iGen increase from generations past? Anecdotally, I think that it's certainly true. I think it's safe to say that watching porn, accessing porn has certainly increased as technology has made it more readily available. I think that's safe to say. I don't have any real data to support that. but it's just, I mean, it's obviously going to be the case, right? When you put a smartphone in the hands of a 13-year-old boy, and it's unrestricted to the internet, you're obviously making pornography much more accessible to him than when I was 13 years old and I didn't have any internet at my house. And so that technology is obviously going to make those things go up. Some things that I've read though about, sexting, pornography, all those things, is that yes, it is affecting the sexual lives of young people, where they would choose the easier path of those impersonal sexual encounters rather than having a personal sexual encounter with someone. It's the path of least resistance. And so there's a lot of young people that are choosing, they're actually choosing loneliness in their sex. So even sex is making them more lonely because they're choosing to engage in it with pornography and things of that nature rather than actually in human relationships. For years, you could count on having to struggle through an awkward sex series at youth group. With these statistics, should we continue to devote time to that or maybe shift approach to digital sexual experiences? No, I think that the shift definitely needs to take place. Now, I will say this though: youth workers still need to be talking about sex to the students in their youth group, but the experience has definitely changed. We can't assume that this generation is that they're encountering those issues in the same way than previous generations. I would say if you're going to have an annual series with your youth group at church, they need to be taught about technology. They need to be taught about social media. They need to be taught about what it's doing to them and their mental health. They need to be taught good habits for disengaging from that social media addiction that they have. And again, they need to be given the opportunity to interact in a personal way with other people and develop real living relationships with people, rather than just having virtual relationships. So if I were a youth minister, I wouldn't stop talking about sex, but I would certainly start talking about sex in a digital world, in a digital age, and how that certainly is changing the experience. And more than anything, I would talk to students about technology and how technology is affecting them in ways that they're not always aware of. Another question is, do you believe baby boomers or Gen Xers have also been affected by the concept safe spaces or avoiding thoughts that might challenge their worldview? Oh yeah, I think we all have. It's the language that we've sort of adopted, right? The language of safe spaces, the language of, and that, what that is it's tribal language, right? So I have my group, I have my tribe, we know what we believe, we know what's right, and we don't have any time or patience or energy for really taking seriously someone from another tribe. And so instead of engaging in a conversation or a dialogue, instead we just put up walls, we put up barriers, we run to our safe spaces. I don't want to have to interact with any ideas that might challenge me or make me uncomfortable. And so instead I'm gonna basically wall myself up behind this tribal identity. And listen, many of you know I spend a lot of time on Twitter. Twitter is maybe the worst social media platform for this happening, because Twitter allows us to sort of curate our digital existence. So we're only being exposed to thoughts and ideas and ideologies that make us feel uncomfortable, or that make us feel comfortable rather. And so when someone comes along and says something that makes us feel uncomfortable, our natural inclination is to lash out and to be cruel or dismissive or whatever. And so we all, to a certain extent, are being affected by this language. And again, for me, a lot of it comes back to tribal politics and tribal identities, rather than engaging charitably with other people who might disagree with us. Another question here, let's see. How much of these untruths would you attribute to postmodern views of rhetoric? I mean, I think in their philosophic roots that you could see a family resemblance. Philosophies always have a tendency to manifest themselves in sort of concrete ways culturally, right? We sort of ingest philosophies and we create cultural artifacts that reflect those philosophies. But I'm not convinced, though, that the people who are arguing for these untruths are at all informed by these philosophical schools. I think it's just become sort of. I read this quote, and I think it's true, that the power of any culture is in what it normalizes. So whatever a culture normalizes, whatever a culture creates as being sort of the standard default position, whatever, like that, we have a hard time seeing it in any other way, right? Because it's been normalized to such an extent. And I think these untruths have been normalized by our culture to such an extent that we've stopped even being able to be critical of them. We're not being thoughtful of them because they've just been normalized by our culture. How do we help them to filter or to turn off this fire hose of information? Is their darkened sense of humor an indication of being desensitized to it all? Yeah, there's kind of two questions there. How do we help them turn off this fire hose of information? Man, that's a good question. I would say there's several different things that you could do. Three things that I would say is, first of all, limit the amount of time that they spend on screens. It's interesting. We have access to some of the most advanced digital technology that the world has ever seen, right? Each one of us carries a supercomputer around in our pockets. But yet we choose to spend our time on the supercomputer, playing games like Candy Crush or watching stupid videos on YouTube or whatever. So it's not like we're leveraging this technology to actually make ourselves better or to grow as humans or whatever. We're actually, there's a book called The Shallows that it talks about how the internet is affecting our brain, and actually having access to all this information and all this technology it's not making us more deep. It's actually making us shallower. So having too much information actually makes us dumber. And so what I would encourage, and what I encourage my kids to do, is put the phone down, put the iPod down, put the game control. You're going to spend an hour reading a book. And they generally enjoy it after they get going in it, but they need to be told, okay, you need to slow down your thinking. You just need to read a good book, instead of just wasting your time, your energy, and your mental wavelengths, wasting it watching YouTube videos or whatever. So read a good book, have a good conversation with someone who's older than you, learn how to ask good questions, stuff like that. Have real human interactions, instead of just, again, exposing yourself to the fire hose of information that you find on your phone. Do you think that this untruth trend is reversing? I assume that that's a reference to all three of the untruths. Maybe. I hope so. Jonathan Haidt, in particular, and also Greg Lukianoff, the other author, he runs a website called Fire, which actually traces some of these trends on college and university campuses. And you could make the case that in some places these trends are starting to reverse. But in other ways, these trends just continue, especially on college and university campuses. So I think it's too early to tell about what the national trend is doing. The best that we could do is honestly pay attention to what's right in front of us. What work can we do in our immediate context to reverse some of these trends? Couple more questions. What do you think this research might say to churches who are thinking of how to best use technology for the sake of their ministry? How should we balance our use of digital tech, social media, in order to speak the language of the people we try to reach? And when should we resist those things in order to curb some of the negative consequences of them? David Hefferon asks that. David, that's what I hope to be able to find out. With some of my doctoral research that I'm doing right now is exactly in this area. How do we leverage technology well for ministry? How can we thoughtfully use technology? I don't think there's enough theological reflection about technology, both good or bad. And so I'm going to kind of bail on the question and just say this. There's a lot of thought that needs to take place, a lot of work that needs to be done to not just naively or blindly embrace every new technology that comes our way, but actually think through, okay, technology is not neutral. Technology does change the person that uses it. And so as leaders, we actually need to think through, okay, if I adopt this new technology, how is it going to change the nature of discipleship in the people that I'm leading, the people that I'm serving? Now, maybe it will affect them in some positive ways, some ways that actually lead them closer to Jesus, closer to each other. But I think it's also often the case that that new technologies that we adopt could actually hinder discipleship in some important ways. They could actually hinder community building in some really important ways. So what I preach is, honestly, I just preach wisdom and discernment. Like, we actually need to think these things through instead of just being seduced. Gosh, it's so easy for us to be seduced by the latest and greatest technology, because technology will allow us to do all sorts of cool things, right? But the question is, should we be doing all those cool things? Might we actually be counterproductive to making disciples if we embrace every new technology that comes our way? That's the thought that we need to put into this. 2 more questions. Have you seen an increase of awareness of the negative effects of digital exposure in the general public, or is this revelation still in research and academia? Have you observed school administrations, public officials, millennial parents moving to limit social media exposure in early teen years? Yeah, that is a trend that is definitely happening. So if you think about it, the iPhone was invented in 2007, first smartphone. Facebook, I think, became open across the country about the same time. Twitter, maybe a couple years later. Basically, the point is, this technology is right around 10 years old. So we're still in a lot of this technology, we're still in just the beginning phases. And I mean, you hate to say it, but we're actually experimenting with our kids, not necessarily knowing what the results of that experiment are going to be, which is terrifying to me as a parent, because no other generation in human history has been exposed to this type of information, this type of technology. So we don't necessarily know what all the results are going to be, but we're starting to see what some of the results could be. We're starting to see the mental health problems. We're starting to see the disconnection from real life. Like I said, we see it. This is not just an academic thing. We see it on our college campus. The number of students now that need interventions for depression, for anxiety, for all sorts of mental health issues have skyrocketed in recent years on all sorts of college campuses across the country. We're actually we're living with the implications of this among our college students today. And those who have eyes have to see. Those who have ears have to hear that the results of the experiment are starting to be manifested in our college-age students. So the question is, how will we respond? And this is just anecdotal, but I've seen, just in stuff that I've read and even in interactions that I've had with other parents, there is this growing awareness, like, no, we've actually got to be sane about this. We've got to actually have some limits to this. We can't allow our 12-year-old to have a Facebook or a Snapchat or whatever. Like, we've got to figure out some good boundaries and limitations, just like I imagine previous generations had to do when cable TV was invented. You know, parents all of a sudden had this new technology that they had to deal with in their homes, and eventually they had to come up with some sort of way to provide boundaries and restrictions that were going to allow their kids to continue to grow and flourish. Some of those parents chose to cut cable out altogether, just like some parents today are choosing to cut smartphones out altogether. Other parents will come up with other sort of ways to restrict the use or whatever. So so yeah, we're in the beginning phases of that. And what I'm hopeful for is in the next 10 years, now that this technology has been invented, I think the next phase of this technology is going to be us learning how to control it. And you even see it like in some of the new iPhone updates and stuff like that, how there's now, you know, restrictions that you could put on screen time and restrictions that you could put on certain apps. You know, those restrictions didn't exist even a couple years ago. But some of those changes are starting to happen, and they're really good. As the iGen is, this is the last question. As the iGen is becoming a part of our adult churches, what are some things you've seen success in for producing a community mindset as compared to a consumer mindset? Honestly, I think it's still a little bit early to tell. A lot of these iGen students are still pretty young, but I think one of the things that is noteworthy to me is the emphasis on tangible, tactile service, service of others, interacting with others. That's this generation is living their lives so much online that one of the gifts that we can give them is we can give them the opportunity to be plugged into a community, a real community that has real diversity, that has real, you know, presence in your life, challenging these students to actually serve in a physical, real way. Don't just be hashtag activists, you know, actually go out there and do something. That's the gift that we can give this younger generation. Now, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to get them out of some of those patterns and those tendencies. But I would say the best hope that we have of reaching this generation is not to try to double down on technology. Well, this generation's on Snapchat, so I guess we got to be on Snapchat too. Or this generation's on. I don't think that that's the best approach. I think the best approach is actually to give them what they are choosing to deny themselves through the sort of digital lives that they're living. And so give them the opportunity to have real community, give them the opportunity to serve in a real way. I think that's going to be the way forward with this generation. Well, that's all the time I have. I appreciate all the questions. I hope that you have in some way benefited from this webinar. I know it's been great for me just to be able to interact with you, answer these questions. It's kind of funny talking about technology and all these things while literally doing a webinar where I can't see any of your smiling faces. Or maybe your sleeping faces, as the case might be. But I do appreciate this. I'm going to be putting the PowerPoints up on my website at some point in the near future, chadragsdale.com. And again, within the next day or so, you'll be getting a digital copy of this as well. And so again, thank you. God bless. We'll see you later.